Thank you very much for those, if not authentically written, authentically felt words. And moreover, thank you to all of you for taking a lovely autumn afternoon and committing to be with one another in this space. In a really outstanding school. I am so glad to be here. One of the many great things about becoming president is that, at least for a brief time, people actually take your ideas seriously. When we first discussed what might happen during this anniversary weekend, in addition to the Eucharist and installation tomorrow, I suggested we have a panel discussion with invited guests, followed by an inaugural lecture. Wonderful, the staff exclaimed. Encouraged, I argued that the panel consist of fine scholars and practitioners, all responding to an important theme. Marvelous, chimed the faculty. Really emboldened by now, I urged that the theme should be all about ministerial wisdom. After an ever so slight pause, they quickly added, brilliant. I once worked under a dean who was a British expatriate, a diligent fellow with repressed emotions. During faculty meetings, when matters veered out of control and disintegrated into the petty fights we loved to rehearse, once the dust settled, this poor dean would mutter to himself, "Brilliant." Not a compliment, but his compressed evaluation of our collective stupidity. So is that how the topic of ministerial wisdom strikes you? I owe you an explanation. As I've said on other occasions, seminaries are not ultimately about education or preparing leaders. Those are surely the means and partial aims for what we do, but at heart, we exist to promote the fuller proclamation of the gospel in daily life by all the faithful. Our ultimate aim is to identify and nurture the gifts of disciples whose lives and labors show the unearned mercy of God to a world that often knows nothing of this. The question we then face as a school is how best to do this through the leaders we prepare and the education we provide. In a rapidly changing world, often divided, despairing, and desperate, in a society that is weary and wary of so many institutions, not just religious ones, just what should guide our present efforts at LSTC? That's the real question behind the topic for this afternoon, because to tell you the truth, I could use a few good answers. One way to answer that question is to play the fortune teller. We peer into the future for clues about what to do now in theological education, tracking recent trends to guess emerging needs. Such an exercise has value, of course, because some trends truly are deep, broad, and reliable enough to offer a glimpse of what's ahead. But it's still only a glimpse, and I am dubious about how helpful that always is. Many highly likely trends have sweeping dimensions which doesn't exactly contribute to their local usefulness. Like horoscopes, they will prove to be right simply because they are so broad. What becomes much hazier when you look ahead are the specific nuances, the unintended consequences that would really be valuable for planning your next steps. But even when you become much more specific, it's often remarkable how little you can accurately anticipate. 2 years ago. Most of the major events that have happened since in my personal life alone, including standing before you on this occasion, were simply, flatly not on the radar screen. What about for you, or your family, or your community? And that raises a final concern I have about trying to divine what's ahead. Even if our predictions were both accurate and particular, they don't tell us what those future states will mean, or what we therefore should do. A downward trend of some kind, for example, may eventually be seen not as tragic, but as a moment for opportunity. The solutions that make so much sense to us today about what we should do regarding tomorrow's problems might, many years in the future, when that day arrives, actually prove inept, if not impossible. You can see I'm a bit suspicious about planning what we should do at LSTC today based solely on what we think might happen tomorrow. So this afternoon, I wanted us to turn in another direction, less about the future to which ministers will respond, though that will always be on our minds, and more about the character needed for right responses, come what may. I asked our panelists to take up this theme and say how they think ministers need to be wired up in order to elicit a fuller witness to the gospel by all the faithful. My shorthand for this topic was to call it Ministerial Wisdom. When I say wisdom, though, I don't mean something abstract or elite, reserved for a sage on a mountaintop or a grizzled codger who's seen it all. Instead, wisdom is my simple term for what Aristotle called phronesis, what Aquinas called prudentia, a notion with a long, rich history. In short, such wisdom is the practical judgment someone shows in the face of whatever happens. It is the ability to render a proper assessment of a situation and then act rightly as a result. Wisdom like this is therefore deeply morally attuned, rooted in a tradition that affirms the good and driven toward aims that seek the good. It is not a package of pre-planned reactions, but stays open and adaptive to new situations, nimble and at times self-critical. Most of all, wisdom like this is practical, grounded in ordinary experience, learned over time in the company of others and for the sake of others. Obviously, such wisdom can be exhibited by people in any station of life. By specifying ministerial wisdom, we are talking about its use by leaders committed to the gospel and the community that bears the cross. I want us to consider how our public leaders in the church, official or informal, can bear a wisdom rooted in and driven towards the good that is nothing other than the abundant life we know through Christ. And while by now this may sound very lofty and ideal, I suspect that we actually know ministerial wisdom when we see it. It's just the character evident in those church leaders we most admire. Maybe you recall someone who, amidst looming crisis or serious conflict, was able to lower the anxiety, honor all parties, let differences be heard. Or maybe you met someone who, when the local community felt adrift or empty, was able to look more closely and see resources that others had overlooked. Or perhaps you were inspired by someone who took an already thriving and healthy congregation into deeper commitment and faithfulness than it ever imagined on its own. All of these are images of ministerial wisdom, and you've doubtless got others besides. So my questions today about this are at once simple and perplexing. What comprises this kind of wisdom? Where does it first develop? And perhaps most important for LSTC, how can we nurture it in others? Whenever you've got a tough task, it's good to ask for help, so that's what I did. I invited our panelists, friends of long standing and friends newly minted, and I asked for their best insights on the topic. We've heard 6 perspectives because something as important as ministerial wisdom cannot be contained or reduced to a single point of view. These depictions differ from and overlap with one another in ways that I hope have stimulated your own thinking. Indeed, maybe it would just be best right now to spend the rest of the afternoon contemplating these. If, though, there's one thing that I've learned in my brief period as president, it's that you're required to speak publicly, frequently, at times with little warning, but always with a bold idea that shows you've got everything well in hand. So it's time to deliver on that outsized expectation. Even so, I won't summarize what others have said far better in their own words and voices, reducing these to my homogenized goo. Instead, I'll offer my own take on ministerial wisdom, which I suspect has resonances with the rest. Let me start with a personal parable. My seminary career from student now to president is bracketed by 2 experiences. Over 30 years ago, no one recruited me for seminary because schools in those days just didn't do that. In fact, I received only 2 mailings from the seminary, the second of which was my letter of admission, poorly printed, cockeyed on a Minio sheet. I then drove from the Pacific Northwest to a campus I had never seen, unpacked my few belongings in a bare dorm room constructed in 1916, and went to the first official meeting of my junior year, which was all about the student insurance plan. Insurance. This was what mattered most. My first step in pastoral formation? Fast forward now to a few weeks after my election as president. I was enjoying a lovely luncheon with the ELCA seminary presidents, my new colleagues. Imagine my surprise, though, when the meeting topic turned suddenly to, yes, proposed changes in the employee insurance plan. Oh yeah, I remember thinking, this is now part of my job. But deeper still, I wondered, so what's the deal with insurance? I mean no criticism of insurance or insurers, nor is this a comment on our national debate on health costs and coverage. Insurance can do great good, matters deeply to many, and I'm thankful to have it. It was just odd to realize that it has also formed a parenthesis around my pastoral vocation. What I want you to do, though, is now to think about insurance as a kind of a symbol for how we approach the world. As a symbol, it shows our very real need for assurance and dependability, a reliable fallback when things go awry. Just like any symbol, then, it therefore implies its opposite. We insure ourselves precisely because things will go awry in ways we cannot anticipate or control. It's like those TSA airport checkpoints that try to root out harm, but by their very existence reveal just how insecure, paranoid, and frightened we really are. That's my point with this parable. When ministry is bracketed by a longing for insurance, for protection and security at all costs, it in fact shows how deep is our fear. And in turn, it dampens our mission. Our home is still in the Hartford area, which claims to be the insurance capital of the nation. One of my fellow parishioners, a manager with Travelers Insurance, signs her emails with the company motto, "Be safe." It's a good wish in her line of work, be safe, but far less so if uttered, say, to encourage brand new LSTC graduates. Can you feel the sort of chilling effect? Not go in peace, serve the Lord, but be safe. We cannot afford ministry that holds to a safe course while managing away missteps. Precisely because our world is ever more uncertain, our efforts must be all the more daring. But the patterns for safe ministry can be set so early, so subtly. In the ELCA, our candidacy process offers profound formation for those preparing for rostered service, accompanied by supportive voices from the wider church. A side effect of that process, though, can be the misperception by students that the real purpose is scrutiny, which leads them to play it safe, say acceptable things, and mute the very questions, doubts, or ideas that might make them really interesting ministers. Our internships hold fine opportunities to explore and experiment, trying on practices of ministry in a place of care and learning. What can also happen, though, is domestication and conformity, learning only how to please others and follow the rules. Our church is blessed with a highly professional clergy that for more than a century has benefited from formalized systems of graduate education, salary scales, vacation leave, and yes, insurance. Along with such developments, though, can come a caste system where fitting in with peers, defending perks, and guarding status become the main agenda. You may quarrel with my portrayal, but I suspect our differences would be more of degree than of kind. Again, my point is not trashing our ways of formation, training, or support, but noting instead how such methods can inadvertently lead to a secured ministry with little appetite for declaring the gospel now or in the years ahead. The ministerial wisdom I want to engender would bear many of the features mentioned by others this afternoon, but for me it would especially be marked by the ability to risk. Since we already know that many conventional approaches to ministry fail to engage current missional needs, let alone future ones, newer ministers must be able to venture out in more courageous and adaptive ways. Ministerial wisdom, therefore, should not only accept the obvious point that we will always naturally face risks, but also respond with a bold eagerness to take risks. But let me pause here to indicate what I do not mean by risk. First, it is not a matter of chance. Risk, as I'm speaking of it, does not result from dumb luck or raw fortune, as if one has simply managed to win the game or beat the odds. Instead, wise risk involves personal agency and serious skill, the sort of purposeful action that takes responsibility for an outcome. Second, risk is not the same as being foolhardy. The latter is impetuous, unrealistic, a danger to oneself or others, and masks reckless behavior with mock courage. Instead, wise risk calls for patience and thoughtfulness, showing genuine maturity that remains fully aware of the consequences. Third, risk does not imply anarchy. Lawless disregard for rules and structures not only ends up producing instability, it creates outright genuine harm. Instead, wise risk recognizes one's given constraints, knows how to work within these as well as stretch them, and as a form of practical judgment, is always oriented toward the good. Finally, risk is unlike heroism. The selfish bravado that typifies lone, valiant figures of stage or screen has no place in what I'm describing. Instead, wise risk is learned and used within community, humbly engaged with the needs of others, and done for their sake. In plain terms, then, the risk that comprises wise, practical judgment isn't just a roll of the dice, and it doesn't require jumping off a cliff. It's neither about hurling bricks and bombs, nor is it like high noon at the OK Corral. So what does it resemble? Maybe it looks like this. It's the summer of 1963 in the rolling Palouse Hills of the Idaho Panhandle. That's my maternal grandfather, Orville, in the driver's seat of an Alice Chalmers HD5, pulling an International 51 combine, consulting with my grandmother, Winifred. Now, I admit, this scene doesn't seem to have much to do with ministry or even look very religious unless you belong to a Canaanite fertility cult or think that farming is next to nirvana. And some do. But just like all forms of practical judgment, the wise risk I want us to consider can be found in all walks of life. When it comes to ministry, I think we can learn a lot from cases like this. The wise risk found in farming may not look very glamorous, but it is still remarkably instructive. Obviously, this scene is at harvest time, which means it was near the end of a very long process. Many months earlier, this same ground had first to be prepared, then seed planted, followed by waiting and watching the crop's condition. But even harvesting was still in the middle of things. Yet ahead were the tasks of hauling the grain for sale or storage, repairing the machinery, and then doing the books and paying the bills. So that we don't romanticize risk, it's very helpful to sense here the vast amount of planning and work that's involved. Wise risk doesn't happen by accident, nor is it effortless. And even with all that, so many variables remained completely beyond my grandparents' best efforts. Weather, erosion, range fires, and of course, prices. The last of these, prices, adds a further dimension to the risk involved. This photo shows a field of wheat, but my grandfather was mainly a seed, pea, and barley man. USDA records from this very period show that the average yield of dryland barley in Idaho was 37.5 bushels per acre, while the market price in those days was a whopping 91 cents per bushel. That means my grandfather could expect his crop to earn about $34 per acre. Since he owned only 90 tillable acres, his entire crop would have earned just over $3,000 in 1963, equal to about $23,300 today. That's pretty meager, yes? But all the more so when those same USDA records reveal that the cost per acre for producing barley was 2/3 the market price. At today's rates, my grandparents would have netted about $8,200 for their efforts that year. They surely knew that prices and profits were beyond their control, yet still they worked like this, year after year, for decades. My point is that wise risk is durable, persisting amidst constraints and even hardship. It involves a pattern of practices that in turn shapes who you are at a very deep level. This formational quality is basic to those who risk wisely, though you can't really see it on the surface of this scene. As some here can attest, my grandparents could be difficult and severe. The fellow who now farms this very plot of land vividly recalls my grandfather's colorful language shouted across the fields as he fought to hold the combine on course on this very rough terrain. There was another side to his temperament, though. I remember one evening during this very summer when the day's work was done. My grandfather was sitting reading the local newspaper, and as he read, he grew increasingly agitated. He finally threw down the paper, turned to 7-year-old me, and unleashed how upset he was that black people in the South were not allowed to vote because of bogus literacy tests and poll taxes. It was my first civil rights lesson, though I didn't realize it at the time. And to this day, the incident amazes me. Nothing back then, nothing explains why racial discrimination would ever matter to a white farmer in northern Idaho. For all his flaws, though, my grandfather knew what was fair, and this just wasn't. My point is not to praise him unduly, but simply to notice that wise risk shapes character. I suspect my grandfather simply saw that the labored struggles of folks far away and very different were not so unlike his own. Wise risk both reflects and reinforces this deep sense of something right and good. Let's turn to another image of wise risk in ordinary life from a few years earlier, and this is perhaps my favorite. The scene is Spokane, Washington in June of 1957, and this is the terminal yard at the headquarters of Inland Motor Freight and Pacific Highway Transport. The man at the center of the trio is my paternal grandfather, Gus, who was president of the company. On either side of him are M.B. Malbo and A.B. Prindle, whose families are quite unaware the two are being featured as part of this lecture. They represented the International Harvester Company, from whom my grandfather had just purchased 29 DCO 405 tilt cab power units, 12 of which appear in this photo. I suppose they were flanking my grandfather to keep him from slipping out of the deal. Let me explain why. As I said, my grandfather had just purchased 29 of these units, the part at the front of the truck. Also in this photo, but purchased separately, were 58 shiny new Brown Company trailers to be pulled behind those international units as doubles. Now, the combined price for each of those tractors with its two trailers was over $100,000 in today's rates, which means that on this one day, my grandfather had spent in excess of $3 million. And this hints at why this is my favorite picture of risk. You see, my grandfather is not exactly smiling. He's also not wide-eyed with terror. He does appear to me, however, rather focused and purposeful. And I like to imagine he was thinking to himself something like, "My God, how will I ever pull this off?" I know that expression because it now stares back from my mirror every morning. What I really want us to notice about this kind of risk, though, is not that it involved a lot of money all at one time, but the context in which it occurred. By the middle of 1957, the United States was plunged into a very deep recession that would last for the better part of the next year. The gross domestic product was declining, not stalled or stagnant, declining at a rate approaching 4% annually. Unemployment across the country hovered at 7.5%, except in Detroit, where unemployment had reached 20% because vehicle sales of all sorts, including trucks, had fallen by 1/3, the worst situation since the end of the Second World War. In those days, trucking was a closely regulated industry, like a public utility. So my grandfather was not free to raise rates or reduce service in order to stay profitable. Instead, he did something that went against the grain. Through this one purchase, he expanded his fleet by 1/4, and thus his ability to haul freight and improve revenue. He was willing to tolerate sudden extreme debt to keep from sinking with the rest of the economy. At the time, most people probably saw it as a bad idea, but wise risk often involves this sort of counterintuitive sensibility. It's the capacity to find shrewd alternatives that don't fit conventional behavior. But the story isn't just about one man, so let's consider the other two fellows in this figure, as well as those who stand just outside the frame. First off, in order to complete this purchase, my grandfather needed the cooperation of Mr. Malmo and Mr. Prindle, mentioned earlier. Given the bleak situation in Detroit, they were surely eager for a sale, but they were also greatly jeopardized by it. If my grandfather failed, so did they. Beyond that, Inland Motor Freight had co-owners besides my grandfather, as well as other officers responsible for the health of the company, all of whom had to agree to this step and share this vision. In other words, wise risk does not result from the individual force of a single massive will, but it typically emerges within community. One person may well be the catalyst for taking such a risk, but it's finally an ensemble effort. But what about being that catalyst? How does that happen? When did my grandfather sense that wise risk was even possible? It probably started fairly early. Along with his older brother and parents, my grandfather left northern Germany in 1903. In Germany, they were itinerant butchers, which meant that they slaughtered meat at farmyards for barter, which means that they were broke. With no reason to stay, they traveled in steerage with 2,200 other passengers on board this, the SS Graf Waldersee. The ship's manifest shows that their journey to New York took 18 days, but the average transatlantic crossing for a ship like this should have lasted only 9 or 10. The extended excursion was due to engine failure that left them adrift for a week in the North Atlantic in February. After a bone-jarring railway passage from New York, they arrived outside scenic Washtenaw, Washington, at a desolate expanse of cheatgrass and basalt cliffs. This was the homestead they now had 5 years to prove up or lose forever. So prove up is just what they did, unlike nearly 2/3 of all of the farmers during the entire Homestead Act. With the deed in hand, they sold the place, bought the town butcher shop, then the livery stable with its one small truck, and eventually that led to the scene that you're viewing. I know, it sounds like a pull yourself up by your bootstraps story, but that's not my point. Instead, I want us to notice the patternedness of this story. Wise risk emerges as a kind of a tradition, a heritage of previous experiences that open someone to see options others cannot and take steps they might otherwise avoid. All of this might seem like a lot to conclude from 2 simple photographs. Still, I think an important part of ministerial wisdom calls for taking seriously the forms of ordinary wisdom around us every day, asking what those could teach us about religious leadership. The images we've explored suggest that as part of wise, practical judgment, risk-taking has several features. It involves planning and work, real effort over time. Likewise, it's durable and persistent, even amidst hardship. As a result, it often has a character-shaping force. It's also marked by a counterintuitive sensibility, able to move against the grain. Next, wise risk unfolds within community, with and for others. Last of all, it's deeply tradition, a pattern of action to be handed down and received. Now, even though I've appeared at least to draw these conclusions just from a pair of experiences, what they've shown us about wise risk is actually supported by many other studies, research that I now want to use to refine our understanding of how such risk works. For instance, a bias in my examples is the weight placed on the practices and qualities of a central figure. We know, of course, that this is only part of the story with risk. In many cases, especially in the church, the risk-taking leader often faces people who disagree or a system that's stuck. What happens then? Fortunately, there's much to be learned, I think, from literature in what's called institutional entrepreneurship, how potent leaders generate change in organizations. One starting point for this research is an observation that goes by the ungainly but accurate name of the paradox of embedded agency. Introduced 20 years ago by Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell, the paradox is this: since leaders or others with agency always operate within complex systems of rules, behaviors, and identities, that is, they are embedded within a structure, well, how then can they ever imagine anything new, let alone get others to adopt those ideas? Either a leader has already bought into that structure and so cannot think outside of the box, or everyone else has and so will never accept any changes. That's the paradox. And then perhaps as a further paradox, at the same time, we all know some leaders evidently are pretty good at being able to produce change. So why is that? The answer is very useful for those who wish to risk wisely, especially ministers embedded in churches. There seem to be at least 3 traits of effective change agents able to overcome the paradox. First, they are willing to understand, reflect on, and then critique the constraints of the system they face, but in an appreciative way. For example, the weight of a received behavior might seem immense. You know, they've always done it this way. But leaders who are effective bother to learn why that behavior matters so much, its driving values, as well as its flaws and fractures, looking for how those might expose new opportunities. Second, change agents know that they have to make sense of a new direction so others feel comfortable following it. That is, they astutely grasp that people must be given a reason to change, a way for change to become legitimate. And this requires engaging others, persuading and reassuring them. Finally, change agents are good at using local symbols and language in this process of persuasion and reassurance. They can translate the new vision into familiar terms with deep roots, so those who might otherwise be wary of it can eventually grasp it as their own. It seems to me that these 3 traits, reflection, legitimation, and translation, are also foundational to those who are really able to take wise risks. Without them, a religious leader may be the only person convinced of the course that needs to be taken. With them, though, that leader brings an entire community along for the ride. I hope you're sensing just how complex and subtle it is to take wise risk. It's not just a matter of screwing up your courage and trying harder, but actually calls for great skill and true sensitivity. A kind of gentleness is needed to implement meaningful risk, even a sort of artistry. Richard Sennett's studies of craft work offer some evocative analogies to what risk takers face. Sennett noticed that a typical problem faced by artisans and craftspeople is something called resistance. Imagine someone trying to carve a delicate figure in wood, only to encounter a knot. Novices deal with such resistance by fighting against it, getting rid of the knot at all costs, which often destroys the work entirely. Masters of the craft, though, try to work with resistance, backing off the pressure, sensing how the wood responds to various tools, and thus finding another way. The idea, Sennett says, is to learn to use the minimum force needed until an alternative becomes clear. Now translate this into ministry. Our fine idea meets with resistance, but we become so convinced of its rightness that we insist and argue and badger, thinking that the opposition will eventually fold. It rarely does, or at least not without high cost. But the skillful minister encountering resistance learns to minimize force and step back, maybe taking on the other person's point of view, maybe adopting a lighter and calmer tone. It's the craftsperson's artistry of knowing when and how to use a gentler touch. And it's exactly what those who risk wisely need to do as well. Of course, Not all risk will be rewarded by success. Some resistance simply cannot be overcome, no matter how gently, and even the wisest risk is still risk and subject to failure. What then? I've already mentioned how wise risk requires durability and persistence, and in the face of thwarted or failed efforts, this becomes especially important. We could, I think, learn a lot from medicine here, where wise risks are taken every day, though not always successfully. Atul Gawande wanted to know why some hospitals had much better outcomes from the care they provided than others. Was it that their preventive measures were so much more effective, and so they just made fewer mistakes? It turns out not. In fact, the post-surgical complication rates at really good hospitals were just about the same as all the rest. What made the real difference was what they did next. They knew how to rescue those failures from becoming complete medical catastrophes. Knowing that risk was unavoidable and mistakes inevitable, they had backup plans, layers deep, to enact when things first went wrong. To me, that's pretty instructive about how wise risk can persist in ministry. It's easy for us to become discouraged when our best ideas aren't immediately accepted or initially enacted. Rather than treating that as an aberration, though, I think we can anticipate it and have rescue plans already in place. Unsurprised by failure, wise risk is always ready with a plan B, or C, or D, or E. By this point, some of you may be wondering what any of this has to do with theological education, ministry, or the wisdom needed for it. But as a practical theologian, my reply is that any part of human life, among or beyond the faithful, should be our concern as Christians, including wise risk in all of its varieties. For too long, we have acted as if human practices must first conform to church language and categories in order to have any theological legitimacy. A reversal of direction is long overdue. Plainly put, it would be strange indeed if wise risk in ministry had nothing in common with the wise risk found in myriad other vocations, all of them valued by God. The church is not completely unlike all other groups, nor is the wisdom of its best leaders. To assert pure difference keeps us from appreciating how the church can learn and benefit from all sorts of human institutions. It's on that basis that I've explored with you the wise risk manifested in quite varied non-church situations. Of course, the church is distinctive in one important way. It understands itself to be called into being by God and sustained by that holy calling. But that's a distinction, not a separation. The church and its ministers should freely, eagerly learn from the wisdom we see at every turn in God's good world. Wise risk is a potent capacity within many vocations, and no less relevant to ministry for that reason. That said, though, I do want to close with a more directly theological insight about the wise risk we need for ministry. Lately, as some of you know, we've been listening to Hebrews in the Sunday lectionary. That led me to revisit the work of New Testament scholar Ernst Käsemann, particularly his long-forgotten 1937 treatise on that epistle. Now, Hebrews is one odd book. with a few pithy turns of phrase and a whole lot of obtuse stuff about sacrifice and priesthood that sounds pretty sketchy today. So why did Nieman study it? And why in 1937? Well, as he watched his own nation spiral into the Nazi lust for conquest and greatness, as he watched the German Lutheran Church capitulate to that lust or cower in silence for the most part, he found in Hebrews a compelling image. The people first addressed in that letter were supposed to see themselves as a wandering people of God, a kind of Israel in the desert. Like those ancient Christians, Nieman saw his own grimy, urban, blue-collar parish as unsettled and adrift. The epistle to the Hebrews was the perfect reminder to them that life with God is, first and foremost, a perennial wandering. We are forever on the way, nothing finalized, but ever unfolding. And while at first that can sound distressing and insecure, Hebrews claims that what really secures us in our wandering is not of our own design, but something from outside of ourselves. God's own word beckons us into life's wandering to follow wherever we might be summoned. We are called by Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, as Hebrews puts it, who precedes us and draws us toward a horizon of life. Our faithful existence is one of wandering like this. It cannot be nailed down or its dangers managed away. It cannot be, if you will, insured. Ministers who take wise risks are honest about this basic fact. If you think you can secure yourself, you'll be so obsessed with protecting your own gains that you'll never take another step. On the other hand, once you realize that your life involves perennial wandering with God, once you trust that life itself belongs to the one who so calls and sustains you along the way, well then you'll never look back. Risk in ministry depends on this kind of theological claim. We can risk wisely not because we are so darned smart or daring, but because we are secured by a promise that opens the way toward lasting life. What a peculiar pairing, secured and yet somehow open, grounded in a promise and yet free to risk. Yet I saw an image of this once in a church that stands on another shore. The structure of that church, the building, is itself quite humble, constructed of field stones gathered 800 years ago and mortared into walls over a meter thick. It's on the inside, though, that you find the image that stays with me. Really, two striking artifacts, one on the floor and the other overhead. On the floor is a baptismal font. It's a huge bronze kettle weighing hundreds of kilograms held up by a stand. Each leg of the stand consists of a separate human figure, one for each evangelist, bearing the kettle marked by the figure of the 12 disciples. So get this, the evangelists bear up the 12 who embrace the deep basin of water in which all of that congregation's members have been baptized since the 13th century, including my own ancestors. Think of all the dying and rising in just that one pool. This is where promise begins. In baptism, you are supported by those who came before you, all of you united to Christ, borne up by his dying and rising for the humiliated of the world whose wandering we now share. And once you've pondered that, then your eyes drift upward to notice ships. Yes, ships, just where you would not expect them to be, rigged sailing ships floating in the air, headed toward the east. The village of my ancestors included many people who spent their lives on the sea. Washed in the waters of baptism, they then plied their fishing trade amidst the raging perils of the open ocean. It was a desperate and dangerous existence. One winter, one of my own great-great-uncles never returned from a fishing expedition on the North Sea, and he was no exception. So, when a ship survived great calamity or near disaster, and its sailors returned home, they built a replica of the vessel and suspended it from the church ceiling as a sign of disaster averted, a sort of physical prayer of thanksgiving to God for bringing them home. And notice what they named this one? Emmanuel, God with us, the great fishing bark of Christ. Maybe these flying ships sound strange, but to me, they're an image of wise risk. It turns out that when Germans talk about the field of leadership exercised by ministers, they use an odd term, kybernetic. There's no equivalent in English where the word sounds like cybernetics, the study of machines and robots. But the word actually comes from a Greek term near the end of the book of Acts, where it refers to the pilot of a ship. The pilot is, of course, not the ship itself, its timbers and sails, nor is the pilot the same as the crew of the ship, those who repair the hull and trim the sails, and the pilot is surely not the wind that drives the ship, filling its sails and causing its wood to creak and groan. No, the pilot is simply responsible for one small thing: to direct the rudder that sets the course. Those flying ships in that little German church remind me that ministry is a kind of piloting on the open sea with the wisdom to chart the course and the risk sufficient to maintain it. In days dangerous and uncertain, ministers do what pilots always have. They know their place aboard the ship, among the crew, and with the wind. They grasp what they can do and accept what is not theirs to control. Most of all, they wisely hold a sense of direction, aware of where they are finally headed, bound ever eastward toward the rising dawn of the one who gives light to the whole world. Thank you for your time this afternoon.